Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support, please subscribe. The Forbidden Love of Elizabeth I, Robert Dudley. Elizabeth I has gone down in history as being the queen who never had any children and never married. She was even dubbed the Virgin Queen. She was the daughter of a tyrant, Henry VIII, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth became something of a stark contrast to her father. It is even said that even though Elizabeth had many potential suitors, she gave nothing more than fair words but no promises. There is only one man who has been recorded to have even slightly tempted her to share her crown. That man is Robert Dudley. Now Robert was born in around 1532 or 33 and was son to John, the Duke of Northumberland. Robert met Elizabeth when they were both children, and under the reign of Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary I, both Robert and Elizabeth were to cross paths once more. Robert had led troops in support of a coup organised by his father, and that subsequently led to him being thrown into the Tower of London. Elizabeth also happened to be in the Tower at that time, for she had been suspected for plotting against Mary. Now Elizabeth and Dudley were reunited in the Tower, but as children they shared the same tutor, Roger Ascham, who had been impressed by the pair. You see, Robert and Elizabeth had been there as each other's shoulder to cry on when tragedy struck, and when Elizabeth was 8, that is exactly what happened. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, was executed in 1541, and she confided in her friend and made the vow that she would never marry. Maybe Elizabeth's vow is the reason that when Robert married 9 years later, that he kept his wife, Amy Robsart, away from court, possibly being mindful that his marriage could damage the relationship he had with Elizabeth. It is even believed that the terror that Elizabeth felt when her half-sister reigned, putting her in constant fear for her life, brought her even closer to Dudley. He remained loyal to her and even risked his own safety to help her. They had so much in common, including a shared love for hunting and dancing and spirited conversation. The hours they spent together were great, but the gossip that followed filled the princess's household, for Robert Dudley was a married man. However, the gossip and the loyalty would be worth it, for when Elizabeth became queen in 1558, Robert would be rewarded. He was immediately made Master of Horse, a prestigious position that required regular meetings with his queen. But meeting in private was not easy. Elizabeth's moves and actions were being scrutinised by not only her court, but by all of Europe. Elizabeth had been noted as saying 1,000 eyes see all I do. But even so, she had made it clear to all those around her that she was not going to give Dudley up. And being the quick thinker that she was, Elizabeth found many new ways to ensure she could spend as much time as she could with him, even moving his bedroom next to her private rooms. Also, she could facilitate their secret meetings. However, these increasing meetings and their blooming friendship caused for the gossip of England and the European courts to spread the word of scandal like wildfire. The intimacy that was obviously shared between the pair meant that endless speculation was provoked about just how close they really were. Elizabeth's rival and cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, firmly believed that Elizabeth and Dudley were lovers, and later told the noblewoman Bess of Hardwicke that he had visited the Queen's bed numerous times. But even so, it is very unlikely that Elizabeth, having seen so many powerful examples of perils of sex and childbirth, would have risked the throne she fought so hard for by sleeping with her favourite. But their friendship probably charted a careful course between platonic and sexual. But the rumours were just something that would not disappear, for they sprung on her again in the year of 1587. A man by the name of Arthur Dudley arrived at the court of Philip II of Spain. He claimed that he was the secret illegitimate child of Elizabeth and Robert, saying that he was conceived in 1561, a date that also happened to coincide with Elizabeth being bedridden with a mysterious disease that had caused her body to swell. The claim had a chance of credibility, especially because Arthur could name the servant who took him away from Hampton Court Palace and then raised him as his own. The servant only then confessed the truth on his deathbed in 1583. But with all this being said, there is not a single shred of evidence to support it. Going back to the fact that Robert married Amy Robsart, it was her death that took away any hope that Elizabeth may have had of one day marrying him. For the circumstances surrounding she was found at the bottom of a short flight of stairs with a broken neck. Whether it was an accident, suicide or murder, it had never been resolved beyond doubt. The finger of blame, however, was then firmly pointed to Robert Dudley, and his enemies even claimed that Robert would not have flinched from having his own wife put to death so that he could realise his ambitions of marrying the Queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, is even noted to have said that the Queen of England was about to marry her horse-keeper, who had killed his wife in order to make way for her. But the finger also pointed towards Elizabeth, for many believed that her passion for Dudley had driven her to have his wife murdered, so that she could have him at last. But all the evidence makes it extremely unlikely that Robert or Elizabeth had anything to do with the death of Amy, or lack of evidence, should I say. Why would they have taken such risks, especially if they did plan to marry? For killing Amy would have been extremely counterproductive to their plans. The scandal that arose flew around the whole of Europe, so Elizabeth had no choice but to distance herself from Robert, so not to further implicate herself. However, Elizabeth still refused to give up on him. He was her favourite. She went to such great lengths to conceal their meetings, and in November of 1561, for example, she disguised herself as the maid of Catherine Howard, later Countess of Nottingham, in order to enjoy the secret pleasure of watching Dudley shoot near Windsor Castle. Another attempt at discretion was less successful. When her close friend and attendant Lady Ferns de Clinton helped Elizabeth escape court in disguise to meet Dudley at his house for dinner, Philip II of Spain's envoy heard of it and immediately reported it to his master. Elizabeth and Robert exchanged many letters, and they used the symbol of 2 O's with accents above. The symbol that was nicknamed Eyes was to match the nickname that Elizabeth had given Robert. In a locked desk next to her bed, something that was spotted by the Scottish ambassador Sir James Melville. When Elizabeth was searching for one of his own royal mistresses, Melville asked Elizabeth if he could borrow the portrait to show the Scottish Queen, but she refused, to which Melville, spotting Robert in the corner of the room, said that she should not cling so to the portrait, since she had the original. Elizabeth then began to consider potential suitors, or that is what she wanted the world to believe. Elizabeth would never commit to any of them. The Venetian ambassador shrewdly observed, "She has many suitors for her hand, and by protracting any decision keeps them all in hope." Robert, however, with the fading of the scandal that surrounded him over his wife's death, then began to pursue Elizabeth to make her his wife. He showered her with his undying love and affections, something that Elizabeth received with pleasure, but no promises. This made Robert become desperate, and in 1575 he made one last attempt, and a spectacular one at that, to win Elizabeth's heart in a way that would make her want to marry him. So Robert Dudley pulled out all the stops he could. He owned an estate in Warwickshire called Kenilworth Castle, where he had a whole extension built just for her. At the castle, Robert staged several days of extensive and lavish entertainments that would have cost him a large amount. Although Queen Elizabeth loved every second of her stay, she knew that marrying Robert would lead to disaster in her kingdom, so she refrained from allowing herself to fall for Robert's ideas, and did not let herself be fooled that she could have a happy marriage with him, and retain her place as sole ruler of the English throne, and avoid civil war. But saying that, Elizabeth then remained at Kenilworth Castle for around 3 weeks. With all of Dudley's desperation to marry the Queen, he had been secretly courting one of her ladies-in-waiting, Lettice Knollys. Described as being one of the best-looking women at court, she was of royal blood, being the great-grandniece of Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. This no doubt added to her attraction for Dudley, who had enjoyed a flirtation with Lettice for the previous 10 years. Now that his last-ditch attempt to persuade Elizabeth to marry him had failed, he took Lettice as his mistress. For a time, Elizabeth was blissfully unaware that her favourite was betraying her. But 3 years into the affair, Lettice became pregnant. She was not a woman to be set aside, and insisted that Dudley marry her. Fearing the inevitable backlash from his royal mistress, he agreed only to a secret ceremony, which took place in 1578. The bride was said to have worn a loose gown, a coded reference to her pregnant state. It was not long before the secret leaked out of court. When Elizabeth had heard the news that her own cousin had stolen the only man she had ever loved, she was thrown into a jealous rage and screamed at Lettice that, as but one son lightened the earth, she would have but one queen in England, before banishing the flouting wench from her presence and vowed to never set eyes on her again. Elizabeth May had eventually forgiven Robert, but the intimacy that had defined their relationship was now lost. But it was the following year, when her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, was executed at her order, that Elizabeth then turned back to Dudley for comfort. Robert Dudley was also by Elizabeth's side through the Armada crisis of 1588. By now he was gravely ill, but did not hesitate to accept the post of Lieutenant and Captain General of the Queen's armies and companies. Robert then stood beside his Queen when she delivered her famous speech at Tilbury in 1588. She is reported to have said the following: "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Robert then stayed with Elizabeth after the aftermath of the Armada, ensuring that any danger had passed. The last reported sighting of the pair together was then at a palace window, watching a celebratory parade staged by his stepson, the Earl of Essex. At this point, though, Robert Dudley was in poor health, and he then took leave from his Queen, knowing perhaps that it would be the last time that he saw her. A few days later he wrote to Elizabeth from Rycott in Oxfordshire, ending the letter, "I humbly kiss your foot, by your Majesty's most faithful and obedient servant." These were probably the last words ever written by Robert Dudley. 5 days later, on the 4th of September 1588, he breathed his last breath, and Elizabeth was inconsolable at the loss of her sweet Robin, the only man whom she had ever truly loved. Although the relationship between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley was certainly full of trials and tribulations, their bond lasted over 50 years, and she was certainly lost without him. The days after Robert's death were the hardest for the Queen to cope with. She locked herself in her rooms and refused to face her court or her council. Her most prized possession was now the note that Robert had sent her. She inscribed it as his last letter and kept it locked away by her bed for the rest of her life, and any mention of her beloved Robin made her eyes swell up with tears. You see, Robert Dudley and Elizabeth may not have had an intimate relationship, but what Elizabeth got from it filled her heart. She loved no other man, and kept Robert, her favourite, by her side even when the world told her not to. She loved him in her own way. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.